Hello and welcome to this quick presentation about the history and role of stained glass windows in Gothic cathedrals by me, Stanley Wynn. So before diving into the symbolism and meaning of stained glass windows, let's take a minute to understand the history and composition and how that all works with the time period. So for the most part, in the Middle Ages, stained glass was made by painting enamel, which was like a glass-based paint, onto sheets of glass and then curing it. And after that, it was set into exteriors and windows and things like that, and combined with the sunlight, created a really intriguing aesthetic for a lot of architects, which is why it gained a bit of popularity. Now, on its own, stained glass was really weak and couldn't support its own weight for a long time because of its composition. So, as a workaround, architects began using metal bars made out of iron and lead to support the glass. On top of that, it actually worked twofold. A lot of the times, stained glass was on its own really thin and demanding on the eye, so architects constructed their windows so that the bars wouldn't really interfere with the glass or would actually play an integral part in the art. Now, another way that artists achieved this contrast between the colorfulness of the glass and black was to use grisailles. And grisailles were basically ornamental designs painted on the glass using black. And again, this achieved this contrast that's needed in order for the viewer to grasp and appreciate the individual colors of the stained glass without using metal bars in especially cluttered and tight spaces and in designs that would make it unpractical to use metal bars. And this grisailles are actually a kind of technique that we see in the Renaissance period as well. The only difference being that medieval glasses showed grisailles on the indoor side, while Renaissance and post-Renaissance grisailles were applied both on the indoor and the outdoor sides. And so next we move on to the question of why stained glass is so prevalent in Gothic architecture. And that's the simple answer is that Gothic architecture just lends itself really well to the implementation of stained glass. Up until the 10th and 11th centuries, which is when Gothic art began to become really popular, the prominent architectural style was Romanesque, and Romanesque had this huge emphasis on filling up empty interior space with these thick walls full of religious motifs made out of like quartz and things like that. And Gothic architecture really stayed away from this and did the complete opposite. It welcomed and emphasized use of these huge, high, open interior spaces full of these pointed arches. And what that allowed for was really big and wide windows on the walls that made it practical to use stained glass windows. There was enough space that you could really portray art on the windows, and also enough space that it allowed the metal bars to work in tandem with not only the windows but with the actual building itself. And so as Gothic art began to become more popular throughout the world, it began to become the staple, and it was used in all the churches built during the time. And as a result, stained glass became a staple in churches, and many churches began using it as a theological art form and used it to convey biblical scripture. And because of the way Gothic architecture was, its nature, it allowed churches to display these religious events and figures in such a big and beautiful scale that was still practical. It still illuminated and gave light in the church, which was the whole purpose of a window. To give natural light and stuff like that. And commonly they conveyed people like Jesus and different saints with these really vibrant and heavenly colors to inspire their viewers and observers in their journey of faith. And so now let's take a look at two, real world cathedrals that have some of the finest examples of stained glass on them. And we're going to look at the Cologne Cathedral and the Notre Dame de Paris. As you can see at the bottom, every year millions of people visit Notre Dame and other cathedrals as they are the oldest buildings in Northwest Europe. And take a look at these pictures. They're nuts. So, take a look at the Notre Dame. That's located in Paris, France, and they began building it in 1163 and finished in 1345. Now, the most famous example of Gothic cathedral is probably this one, and it contains a lot of aspects of Renaissance Gothic style, which is a bit of a more aggressive, radical version of the traditional Gothic style. You can see that with the flying buttresses and things like that. And throughout its lifetime, it suffered a lot of different bouts of damage and restoration, and most recently a huge fire that they're still building it right now, rebuilding it. they made some controversial decisions, but that's that. So the first piece of stained glass from the Notre Dame that we're going to be looking at is this rose window from its south facade. Now, rose windows generally in architecture depict the Last Judgment, which is the kind of the Christian concept of the second coming of Christ and God's reckoning for all the people living on earth. But that's not really the reason why I chose it. I chose it to display how well stained glass works with Gothic architecture, in particular this rose window, because of the pointed, archy nature of Gothic art. It just works supremely well with the rose window because of the web-like structure that's used to support the glass. On top of that, when viewed from the inside, the window adds this much needed vibrant contrast of color to the kind of monotonous tone of Gothic art. Gothic art is very full of depth and detail, but it's not very colorful. And this window kind of adds this kaleidoscope, jade-like formation of color that's just full of all this religious detail. And there's 3 of these windows on the Notre Dame de Paris, and all 3 of them are regarded as some of the finest examples of Christian art. But like I said, I mainly chose this as a way to display the efficacy of stained glass in Gothic art. Now, the next piece of stained glass in the Notre Dame we're going to be looking at is the panel of prophets. And the reason I chose this is just to display how well this kind of contrast between the black and the glass works to kind of form this layer of depth and detail that stained glass on its own just can't have. Basically, what we see here, though, is the Jesus's prophets and evangelists, Michael, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Mark. And but the main focus here is the use of the black. The difference between different colors of the figures, different details like the naturalistic folds and the clothes, and the different nuances in the facial structure, and this kind of religious and heavenly body that's created by the images and the figures that they represent. It's reinforced by all these luminescence and sheen the colors get from the sunlight, and which is thanks to the medium, the stained glass, and the light shining behind it. And all that combined just gives this panel a lot more weight when viewed from the inside, that it just otherwise wouldn't have if you don't include the medium and the black that's used to differentiate between the colorful and the glass. So next, we're going to be looking at the Cologne Cathedral, and now this cathedral is located in Cologne, Germany. It's the largest cathedral in Northern Europe, and it began construction in 1248 after a fire burnt down the previous one. And through centuries and centuries of construction, it was finally finished in 1880. And 4 years later, until 4 years later, it was considered the largest structure in the world until the building of the Washington Monument. So the stained glass window we're going to be looking at for Cologne is going to be the Lamentation window. I feel like this is one of the best displays of the potential that stained glass has. Now, first of all, it depicts the Lamentation of Christ, which is the event where the people, after Christ was crucified, they took his body off the cross and they mourned and lamented over his body. And we see all of these religious figures like Mary, John, and Paul. And we also see in the sky angels that are mourning the death of Jesus Christ. And this is really when we start to see, a true painting on glass. Because that's what this really is. It's an actual painting on glass. It's full of so many different realistic details. It's on its own, the painting, amazing in its own right. It captures so many realistic details, like the extremely minute physical details, like Jesus's muscles, his kind of contour in his rib cage and chest area. And when this is put together with these really bright and beautiful and heavenly colors that are used on the glass, that are then given this kind of luminescence and body by the light shining behind it, it really fills this kind of space the church has. It fills the empty space in the church. It shines onto the observers, and it kind of adds this regal and holy body to the art. And so that about does it. I appreciate you for listening to this brief presentation about the role of stained glass in Gothic architecture. We took a quick look at the history of stained glass, why it's so involved in Gothic art, and we took a look at some real examples, how it's used to depict religious and biblical events, and also how it works with the Gothic architectural style. But yeah, like I said, thank you for watching. And the last thing I have to show is the references that I used for this presentation. Thank you.